part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole.
Check it out, folks. We are doing back-to-back focus feature lineup on Petticoats and Poppies. Today, we are discussing Robert Eggers' Nordic epic, The Northman, which is currently available to rent or buy on Amazon Prime Video. And honestly, I think this was one of the movies that we were really excited to get the opportunity to talk about. So, Nicole, please tell the listeners about The Northman.
Absolutely. So, like you were saying, this is a really big historical epic film. It is directed by Robert Eggers, and the screenplay is by, and I'm so sorry for every Scandinavian name that I'm going to butcher in this podcast, but the screenplay is by John, an Icelandic poet, novelist, screenwriter, lyricist, mostly known for working with Björk and Robert Eggers, and the film stars Alexander Skarsgård, Nicole Kidman, Claes Bang, Anya Taylor-Joy, Ethan Hawke, Bjork, and my fave, Willem Dafoe. It is based on the legend of Hamlet, which I'll be talking a lot about later. But basically, it's about a Viking prince who sets out to avenge his father's murder by his uncle. So think Hamlet, but with Vikings. And it was filmed in Northern Ireland and Iceland, which you can definitely tell whenever you're watching it. There's some gorgeous, gorgeous scenery in this movie. It was filmed on a $70 to $90 million dollar budget. We don't have like an exact number yet from them, but it, I think as of right now, has only grossed $58 million. It is still in theaters in some places. So if you've not seen it, this is my plea for you to go see it if it's still showing around you.
Please, it's so good. This movie was everything that I didn't know that I needed. Genuinely, I compared this to having a spiritual experience, and I don't think that is hyperbole. I genuinely just felt so much and was so taken aback by the scenery, the performances, the script, the beauty of the story that is being told and the conflict. And I felt like it was an antithesis to the machoism of Vikings, because of by the end of it, obviously spoilers, but by the end of it, that the path that he has taken, while it is this path that he feels like he's destined to be on, is the wrong path. But the way that it shapes it is even though he has died, he's still, his line continues, and the way that the tree of life, or whatever that symbolism is, indicates his daughter as being the one to lead. I don't know, it hit me really hard, and I don't know, particularly, I don't know why. I do have a really deep passion for Norse mythology. I dedicated basically the last 2 years of my college to personally researching this and personally delving into this. I have a stack of Vikings books that I bought during that period of time, and Norse mythology books, and just really delved into that. And I have a really weird base of knowledge on Vikings and Norse mythology, and I love this so much. And I've always had a lot of issues with how Vikings and Nordic mythology have been portrayed in media. I will say that Netflix's Viking shows are very good, par for the course in terms of historical accuracy and actual respect to paganism during this period of time. And I was just so happy to see it on the big screen, and done so well and with so much care and detail put into it. I loved everything about this movie except for the bits that were obviously Hamlet-ish. The scene between Alex and Nicole, I pulled my jacket up over my head so I didn't have to watch, because I physically recoiled so much at the prospect of that, because I knew it was happening. I knew it's Hamlet. It's not like it didn't take me by surprise, but it still took me by surprise, and I was still just horrified. And just the fact that they most recently played husband and wife and Big Little Lies, which was a pandemic binge for me. And then to see her playing his mother, and then the whole thing, the whole Oedipus Rex complex just made me want to throw up.
Yep.
I loved everything except that. And honestly, like, I understand the purpose of it. I understand what she's trying for. I think that she made some tactical errors. You don't tell your husband that this is happening and then like make it a publicly known thing. You do it surreptitiously. Yep. You tell your son, oh yes, of course, you're here to save me. This is wonderful. And then you planned behind his back. You don't I don't, she was not thinking, clearly not thinking well.
Nope.
I know what was happening. I just didn't want to see it. I do not want to see it, do not want to smell it, do not to taste it, do not to hear it, nothing. None of my senses wanted to be assaulted by that.
Did you taste it?
It was the bile that I felt. Yeah. So what are your thoughts, Nicole?
Yeah. So, things that I love include Norse mythology and Hamlet, and things that the Northman includes are Norse mythology and Hamlet. So obviously I vibed with this. I also, like, anytime a movie has Willem Dafoe in it, I'm immediately like +1 point. I love Willem Dafoe so much. I'm actually thinking about getting a fish and naming it Willem Dafish.
I love that.
Thank you. I thought you'd appreciate that. But yeah, and he was absolutely as chaotic and crazy in this film as I could have ever hoped for, which this movie is bonkers. Like, it's insane. I love it. It has some really interesting, like, fantastical, like, mythological sequences in amongst a, like, fairly historically accurate depiction of Viking life, which I think is this, like, really interesting dichotomy in the film of, like, the very fantastical elements and then, like, the very gritty, realistic parts. My sister and I saw it together in the theater, and it was a wild ride. I have rarely been in an audience for like a non-franchise film that was that responsive to something. Like, people were like yelping at things and audibly reacting to everything. It was incredible. Especially that scene between Alexander Skarsgård and Nicole Kidman, which I, without meaning to, said no out loud during. It was gross. But also, like, this is the Nicole Kidman that I know and love. I don't know where she was last year, but she's back. Love the wig. But I, really admire too that they managed to make a fairly historically accurate Viking film and yet have complicated female characters who have agency. Amazing how you can, make a film set in this time period and still have really cool female characters, to all the filmmakers who say that that's not possible. Yeah. I would follow Anya Taylor-Joy into literally anything, and the fact that I made a priority out of going to see this film in theaters is proof of that. She's so good in this. She's so consistently good. I honestly think that she is like one of the best actresses who's sort of at the beginning of their career right now. And I'm so excited to see everywhere that she goes from here on out. I think that we should just let Robert Eggers keep making his little historical films forever. Like, please. I loved that interview. I don't know if you saw it, where they asked him, like, would you ever want to make a film set in contemporary times? And he was like, no. I was like, a man after my own heart.
He gets it.
He really does. So, keep making us movies. We'll keep reviewing them. But to start out, I wanted to talk a bit about the myth of Amleth. Because, listen, I feel really dumb because I watched this movie and I was like, wow, it really reminds me of Hamlet. And then I found out that, yeah, it's based on the same thing that Hamlet's based on. But at least I'm not like those headlines that I saw that were like, the Northman, very similar to the Lion King.
I was like, wow, I can't imagine why. It's almost as though they are both Hamlet.
Right. Like, but I was like, at least go for Hamlet, like not the Lion King. Yeah. Cultural literacy is dead. But in any case, first of all, if you're wanting to know more about this, there's a very good page about it on the British Library's website. But Amleth is a mythological medieval figure in Scandinavian legend. It is the inspiration for Shakespeare's Hamlet, because Shakespeare never did anything original, apparently. I really love his sort of, let me copy your homework, but I'll change it a little bit. Don't worry here, where he was like, it's fine. I'm going to move the H from the end of the name to the front of it. No one will know that I copied it. But there is no evidence that Amleth was real, but the story itself is thousands of years old, so there is still some debate about whether or not Amleth was a real person. What we know about this is mostly from what was written down by Saxo Grammaticus in the 13th century in the Gesta Danorum, which is a collection of Danish history. The older parts of it are now basically assumed to be mythology, but the latter parts of it are more like actual historical accounts. So the volume also includes the stories of Ragnar Lothbrok and Lathgertha, a lot of other like popular Scandinavian tales. Tales of vengeance at this time were very popular, and you see sort of similar stories to this in a lot of different versions in Scandinavia and also sort of across Europe at the time. What's interesting in sort of comparing this to Hamlet, though, is that Amleth, both in the film and in the legend, has no moral conundrum at all about his plan to kill his uncle. Like, Hamlet spends most of the play going back and forth on sort of the morality of what the ghost of his father has asked him to do. Whereas Amleth, nobody has asked him to do this. He's decided to do it on his own. And he is not concerned at all about what this will do to his soul or anything. Like, he's just going to go for it. Which I think, that makes sense with the sort of world that he's living in. But the basic story goes, and I'm very interested in why Eggers sort of changed a lot of the names involved. But the King of Denmark makes these two brothers, Horwendil and Fingo, who, depending on which one source you look at, is also sometimes written down as Feng or Fengi. But he makes these two brothers the rulers of Jutland, which is a part of Denmark at the time. And then Horwendil kills the king, marries his daughter Garutha, and they have a son, which is Amleth. Now, Fengo gets jealous of King Horwendil, so he kills him and convinces his wife, Garutha, to marry him. And in most versions of the tale, because there are a couple of different versions, there's also a French version that is probably what Shakespeare was actually looking at whenever he wrote Hamlet. But Amleth does witness his uncle Fingo, who's I think called Fjolnir in the film, kill his father, like we see in the movie. But in these versions of the tale, Amleth pretends to be a fool or to be mad, sort of like in the play Hamlet, and thus isn't killed because, they're like, he's not a threat to his uncle's rule. He's clearly lost it already. But then Fingo starts to suspect him, so he tries to trip him up. He puts him through a series of tests. None of them work. None of them actually find anything out. So eventually Fingo sends Amleth to England with orders for him to be killed by the king there. But Amleth, on the way there, changes the orders to say that the king should kill his attendants and to ask for the hand of the princess in marriage. Amleth comes back home. He arrives to his funeral happening, and he sets the building on fire and goes to kill his uncle who's sleeping. And Amleth is then crowned king after killing his uncle. And he later goes on to have sort of a tragic end because he tries to take over England or something. And that obviously doesn't go too well for him. But he does actually succeed in overthrowing his uncle and becoming king as he, rightfully was in line to be. But the daughter of the King of England is sort of his love interest in the original version of the story. And I think it's interesting that Eggers sort of wove a lot more Norse mythology into the tale. He changed some names around, which I'm not really certain. I couldn't find anything about why he'd done that, but maybe he just wanted things to sound more sort of what we think of as Viking-ish. I also was interested, I've not seen this, I don't know if you have, there is a 1994 film called Prince of Jutland, which is about the story of Prince Amleth. It has Christian Bale, Gabriel Byrne, and Helen Mirren in it, and it also notably is Andy Serkis's first ever movie. Have you ever seen it?
I have. I went on a Bale kick.
Okay, I felt like I remembered that you'd gone on a Bale kick at some point, so I thought maybe you'd seen it.
I spiraled out of control in college over Bale, so I have seen it. It is good. I actually did not realize that it was Andy Serkis's first, so that kind of makes me want to rewatch it again. Yeah, just to get a feel for that because that was obviously not my focus when I was watching it. But yeah, it's pretty good. I mean, it's about what you expect.
Yeah. I think this is probably a more exciting version of this story. I would be willing to guess because the Northman is nothing if not exciting. But for anyone who, like me, sort of recognized Hamlet in the Northman, I do think it's very interesting that Hamlet and this are based on the same story. Even though both of them obviously take liberties. I would say, honestly, Robert Eggers probably takes about as much liberties with the original story as Shakespeare took with Hamlet, and that they end up being very different versions to sort of highlight different themes than were being looked at in the first one. Obviously, Shakespeare went towards a more like, let's look at morality, at, this whole idea of the role of the father and sort of pushing his son and the memory of the father and whatever. There are readings of Hamlet that deal with sort of the whole Oedipal complex, but a lot of people have sort of moved away from that now. This version said, let me lean into it, which I could have lived without. I could have lived without, to be quite honest.
Truly.
But, yeah.
It was all part of his journey. So I have been tasked with talking about Valhalla. And I thought a good way to get to Valhalla, would to also be to discuss the Berserkers, since that was an aspect that was in the Northman. So in the movie, you see Amleth and his fellow fighters go into quote unquote Berserker mode. Berserkers participated in a particular form of combat practice in the Viking Age, in which the fighters threw off their chainmail and their tunics and fought naked. Filled with rage and without fear for their own life, they would be like wolves, howling, brandishing their weaponry, and engaging in a very extreme form of machoism. And kind of the mindset of this practice was that they could use their nakedness as a weapon, particularly since these are men. They often try to protect their exposed bits. And so if you're in battle with these men and they come raging out of the forest completely naked, not only are you going to be taken aback, but you're going to think these men are such good warriors that there is not a fear that any of their dangly bits are going to get cut off in battle. It is such a smart tactic to go into war this way. And it's a psychological weapon, basically, because these men were already feared. There was already a certain degree of notoriety about who the Vikings were when they were pillaging and plundering. So then just this disregard for their own personal safety. And if you just think about men and how manhood is approached,
that's just quite intimidating too.
It's very intimidating.
I feel like this is going to be the weirdest analogy, but was it LBJ who would invite people to meet with him when he was in the pool?
Yes.
Half naked. Right. I would be intimidated.
Right? Oh gosh. So the first, and it's interesting, the word berserker actually comes from the Scandinavian. The word that we have today comes from Scandinavia, which I thought is really interesting. I'm not big on etymology, but I did find that rather fascinating when I discovered that. So there is a first person-ish account from a Norse poet in the 9th century whose name I simply do not think I can pronounce. It is something along the lines of Pjornjon Hornicliffe. I don't know. But I'm so very sorry to this deceased 9th century Norse poet. Please don't haunt me. But he said in this poem that he wrote, the berserkers howled and gods were in their minds. And so this is one of the earliest accounts that we have of these folks. It's fairly hotly contested. It's a hypothesis that some historians have posited. The berserkers may have ingested hallucinogenic mushrooms before they went into battle so that it would induce a careless trance-like state that they would enter into that would allow them to do these incredible feats without fear for bodily harm. Like I said, this is very hotly contested. Most historians, particularly those at the Viking Museum in Stockholm, have denounced this notion entirely, saying that the side effects would have included drowsiness, vomiting, muscle spasms, numbness in the arms and legs, basically meaning that they would have been worthless warriors. And after all, battle was inherently linked to their life. And so they would not risk their ability to fight in battle and to die victoriously if they were inebriated. Of course, the Northman leans into this idea. We see them before the battle getting into this really hyped up, drugged up state. And I mean, we know that there's a lot of stuff that they had access to. It doesn't necessarily have to have been hallucinogenic mushrooms. They could have been smoking something akin to hemp, something akin to cannabis, something that could have induced a more cognizant but relaxed demeanor, especially since we do get these poems like the one that I just referenced where they're talking about the gods in their minds. Like, maybe that's all that it is. They're just saying like they were focused on Valhalla, or they're implying that they were out of their minds and that they had taken something to induce this otherworldly situation. We'll never know unless we get really good with DNA and we start being able to tell like what somebody immediately ingested through their bones. So if we get there, maybe we'll be able to figure out what they were doing before they went into battle, but we really don't know. But it is, of course, really important to note that it would be unlikely that they would take something that would diminish their ability to fight because of how intrinsically linked combat is to the mindset of Vikings during this era. And as we see in the film, Amleth and his father and his uncle have this really intense belief that they are only going to get into Valhalla. They're only going to live a full life if they die in battle. We have that scene really early on in the movie where his father says he doesn't want to die a graybeard, which is implying he does not want to die of old age. He wants to die in battle because that is the noblest way to die in this time period for these specific people. And it is because, like, in order to reach the gates of Valhalla, they would have to die in battle. And this is very much the main belief throughout all of the Vikings. Valhalla is very much like the Christian idea of heaven, very similar descriptions, makes a lot of sense considering that they do have some contact with early Christians at this time period when these like religions were forming and stuff, some interesting borrowing and sharing of ideology. But Vikings do not get into Valhalla by doing good deeds or being good people. Only men killed in battle make it to Valhalla. Valhalla was run by Odin, a god very much favored by aristocratic warriors in particular. Some of the lesser, I don't want to say like lesser warriors, but the less affluent warriors tended to worship Thor a little bit more. Thor is an interesting one because he has like aspects of fertility as well. And so he's not quite the god that you think of when you look at, you know, modern depictions of Thor, a very different kind of thing. And it appealed more to the working man because it was like the fertility of not only your household, but of your fields, and like being a warrior equated to like these gifts that you would be bestowed basically. So Odin was more of this god that appealed to affluent warriors because their sole focus was like dying in battle to achieve like the greatest honor. So that's why they worshipped him. So half of these men who die in combat will travel to Valhalla upon death, led by Valkyries to be greeted by Odin, while the other half gets chosen by the goddess Freya for the fields of Volcanar. I think that's how you say it. This is, again, things that I've only read, never actually heard people say. Big fan of words like that. So much of my education has been that way. So
Same.
Yeah, it's so fun. So fun. So many times I've embarrassed myself in public forums.
Same.
It's terrifying.
It's honestly, at this point, I'm like, that's how you find someone who reads a lot.
Exactly. Yeah. And honestly, like, there's so many umlauts and squiggly lines on these words that I just simply do not know what they're supposed to say. I'm like, I know that looks like a D, Same. But it's kind of slanty and it's got a line. So I'm thinking
I may have mispronounced every name I've said in this episode. Like,
the only word I confidently can say is a fjord. And I unfortunately don't have to talk about fjords here, but
Yep. I only
really,
can say that because of Frozen.
I was gonna say, I'm really proud of that because like Frozen
Yeah.
solidified that I had actually been reading that word correctly my entire life.
Yep.
So
Yep.
thank you, Frozen. Which is so funny because today was a very Frozen-ish day. So looking ahead a few centuries, according to a 13th century Christian scholar whose name is Snorri Sturluson. Snorri. Truly just a fun. I'm so sorry. If anybody listening to this happens to have these names, I'm not making fun of them. They're so unusual. So according to the scholar, Odin was known as the Val Father or the father of the slain. This is because, of course, all who fall in battle are his adopted sons. With them, he mans Valhalla. So like basically like once you die in battle, you're greeted by Odin like you are his son, and then you get like the honor of being part of like the ruling class of Valhalla, even though they're really it's complicated. It's very convoluted. I could be here for like an hour and a half. I'm not gonna torture any of you with this like very fluid concepts of hierarchy in the afterlife because it's a whole thing. Of course, again, because this is a Christian scholar who is relating this, there's a lot of I don't want to say doubt because I don't doubt that what he's saying isn't what he has experienced in his contact with these people, but there is a certain element that like this period is very contentious for the pagans and the Christians because the Christians are trying to evangelize them and very much make a clear statement of detracting from Nordic beliefs and paganism because it is a very appealing concept. It's a little bit more egalitarian. There's a lot of difference in kind of how they function in the corporeal world. It's very fascinating. A really interesting period to study religious contact. So the first mention of Valhalla is recorded by two anonymous poems honoring the deaths of two kings, Eric Bloodaxe, who was killed at York in 954, and Hakon the Good of Norway, who died in battle in 961. Valhalla is also later attested in the Poetic Edda, compiled in the 13th century from earlier traditional sources. It's also mentioned the poem, again, going to slaughter this name, Helga Nogovar, I don't know, Hundiskana Bana 2. I'm truly just phonetically saying this. I am deeply, deeply apologetic. And then Valhalla is also kind of indirectly referenced in stanza 32 of the Voluspa, where the god Baldar's death is referred as the woe of Valhalla. So it's very much something that is known. This is a name that is widespread. This is not something that was like later added to, you know, the tapestries of history. Like it's very much known. And there are 4 different afterlives depending on who you are, how you die. There's a lot of things that go into paganism during this time. So there's Helga Fjell, Hell, Valhalla, and then Folkvanar. So yeah, if you're interested, I'm not going to get into all of this because I was just trying to focus on Valhalla, but it is very interesting, and the gods and goddesses that are related to each of these elements are very fascinating to me, particularly Hell, which is not like the hell that Christians co-opted. And I did like some of the descriptions that are given for Valhalla. Like one in particular is talking about like golden trees and the hall's ceilings being thatched with golden shields, and that there's various creatures that lived in Valhalla. Like there's a stag that has a name that I also cannot pronounce, which is like Epinar. And then there's a goat, Hildrun, and that's described as like standing atop Valhalla, consuming the foliage from the tree of Lidair. Like it's very, very fascinating. And there's elements of it that again are not dissimilar from some of the ideas of heaven at that time and some of the other afterlives. And so it's interesting to see like where things could have been borrowed from and where things could have been pulled from. And I really liked how Eggers depicted the gates of Valhalla with the maidens and like all of the stuff and the Valkyries. And that is my way of segueing into Nicole's topic, which is the Valkyries, which is also just such a fun topic to delve into.
Absolutely. So you might be familiar with the character from Thor Ragnarok, played by Tessa Thompson, who is inspired by the Norse mythology around Valkyries. The idea of the Valkyrie also plays an important role in the Akatar book, A Court of Silver Flames, with this idea of female sort of warrior figures. It's actually unclear where the Valkyrie concept first came from, but we know that it's in the 13th century works Prose Edda and Poetic Edda, which are collections of earlier Norse stories. But so it's definitely earlier than the 13th century that it comes from. That's the first time that we sort of have it on record. Their image also may have changed during the Viking Age to be more similar to shield maidens. There's actually some debate going on right now about this idea because there was this grave discovered not that long ago that they believe points to the fact that there were female warriors amongst the Vikings, and that wasn't just mythological, and so everything's sort of being reconsidered.
And I loved that it's a blink and you miss it moment, but when they're invading that village early on, there's a female warrior that's on horseback, and it's a blink and you miss it moment, but it very much felt like it was paying homage to that recently discovered grave. We don't know enough to make this a full thing in this to make it match some of the records we have, but here's a little thing, here's one for the girlies who want to see themselves on horses with shields and being badasses.
Absolutely. But basically, they're a group of maidens who served Odin. According to some interpretations, they're basically spirits of Odin, or projections of him. That's kind of complicated though. But we'll say they served Odin and were sent to battlefields to choose the warriors who were going to Valhalla. And those warriors would be the ones who would fight alongside Odin at Ragnarok. So basically, they chose who lived and died in battle. And the name Valkyrie literally means chooser of the slain. They rode on horses, or sometimes wolves, and sometimes boars, which is fascinating to me. And they carried shields, wore helmets, all that sort of thing. In some tellings, they could fly in the air or through the sea. Other times, they're more sort of just traditional, have more sort of traditional abilities. And some would protect those that they cared for, while others would target people that they hated and purposely kill them. But the Valkyries also would care for the warriors once they reached Valhalla. They were kind of choosing them to take them there. There are references in Norse literature that both point to the idea of Valkyrie as completely mythical with all these supernatural abilities, but then also point to the idea of human Valkyries with supernatural powers, if that makes sense. So it's kind of unclear exactly, and it seems like they're even in their mythology there was some conflict in different stories and stuff about what they actually were. But the later representations of the Valkyries and modern ones focus on their good qualities, like their love affairs with mortals and the ways that they helped Odin. They're seen as a very transformational power, whereas the earlier depictions of Valkyries are less benevolent. And in Anglo-Saxon mythology, they're one source I read described them as female spirits of carnage, which love that. Some people believe that Freya herself is actually a Valkyrie, even though she's choosing warriors for her own afterworld, not for Valhalla. But the idea that she can come and pick warriors would mean that she is also a Valkyrie, but that's also sort of up for debate, apparently. But the most famous Valkyrie is Brunhild, which is also, supposedly the Valkyrie that's being portrayed in the Marvel comics. She is from the Volsunga saga, the Prose Edda, and the Poetic Edda. She appears in all of those. After she disobeyed Odin, she was made into a mortal and placed in this ring of fire in a deep sleep. So she's also potentially the inspiration for Sleeping Beauty. She's later rescued by a hero, but a bunch of other stuff happens, and she has a very tragic end. But basically, that's what happens if you go against Odin, I guess. But she is sort of the most famous specific Valkyrie. But most of the time, they're sort of talked about in a group. The number of Valkyries is also up for debate. Some sources say 9, some say 12, some say 300, some say that there's not a specific number of them. What I'm getting at is that the thoughts around Valkyries change from story to story, and that's pretty common for what you see in mythology for any culture, that it's not sort of set, which I think also goes to the fact that the Valkyries largely come out of oral tradition and stories being passed down, which is how they tend to, get altered like that in a time before everything was written down.
Yes, I love Valkyries. My self-published book that I wrote my senior year of college, the Valkyries played a very large role in. So I have a soft spot for them, and
We
love
love
that we are still actively learning more about this aspect of Norse mythology. So speaking of the Shield Maiden and the vibes of the Northmen, Robert Iger's frequent collaborator, Linda Muir, was the costume designer on the Northmen. She has also worked with him on The Witch and The Lighthouse. She also worked as a costume designer on one of my favorite series, Murdoch Mysteries, from 2017 to 2018. So I thought that was kind of cool. I was kind of surprised by that. I was like, oh, hey. She also worked on the Canadian television show that I feel like a lot of people still talk about, which was Life with Derek, the step siblings. That series that is often talked about. I was like, oh wow, you've really had a storied career as a costumer. So Muir did an interview with Vogue, which I got a lot of really good quotes from. It is an excellent interview, and I highly suggest, if you are interested in the costumes, to please go find the Vogue interview, because it is full of rarely seen images from behind the scenes in the costume shop. It has her lookbook images, textile samples, sketches, designs, everything. It is a really fantastic interview. And she says in the interview, it was the biggest project I've ever done, the biggest team I've ever worked with, and the best experience of my career. And she had over 80 makers on the project, and they had very tight turnarounds for a lot of what they were doing, just because of COVID restrictions and how often they were actually able to work with people to put costumes on, particularly the background people and stuff like that. She talked about going to a rental house to try to scout for fabrics that she could use. She went to London, Rome, Prato, and Madrid. They did manage to find a lot of textiles that they could use, but they weren't able to find a lot of actual costume pieces that they could reuse for some of the crowd scenes. And there's not a lot of crowd scenes in this movie, except for the village and some of that stuff. And there's a very specific style and look for those. So I see where they ran into these issues with finding pre-made, prefab stuff. But she said they were able to find some boots and shoes and chainmail and helmets for the crowd scenes to help flesh some of that out. But they did end up making a lot of the costumes that we see completely themselves. And she also goes into some details about doing research and figuring out how Scandinavians would dye their clothing. And there was very specific ideas about trims that existed on a binary, so that there were specific trims that the men would wear and specific trims that the women would wear, and there were specific colors that men and women would wear. And she tried to honor a lot of that with some of the choices she made. There's also if you were a little bit higher class, you would maybe have access to silk, but you wouldn't have access to a lot of silk. So you would put a silk trim on something, or you would really utilize the materials you have to signify where you were in society. And she played with a little bit of that with Amleth's mother when she's still married to Ethan Hawke. I'm blanking on the names of the characters. I wish I'd made a note of this. I actually just remembered all of this that I wanted to talk about, because I thought it was really fascinating. But again, it's a lot, and it's talked about in the Vogue interview at length. But she talked about specifically, this is her actual quote: I would look at pieces from museums or things that archaeologists had written, but then to translate that into actually constructing these pieces was a whole other task. And with that, she kind of goes into how you can't 100% translate historical records onto screen. There are certain things that just do not work for what they are doing on camera, or how they look on camera, or, what Eggers was looking for in terms of scenic designs, what they were working with the set designers, things clashed. She talked a lot about the CRS costume that Bjorn wore. and felt very strongly that like her character's eyes had to look a very specific way. It had to be taken from Viking militia era kind of stuff. The cowrie shells for fertility, the bells to ward off evil spirits. She also talked about like on the day that they were getting ready to film the scene, Eggers was like, "Hey, do we have any chicken feet?" And so she went to the set designer, and the set designer had rubber chicken feet that they had used just as like a deep set piece. And she talks about how she took these rubber chicken feet and then they painted it to look better because they weren't ready to go on screen yet. And she like made necklaces while they were waiting to like set up the shot, and then like had it in the scene, and like you can't even really see it, but like it mattered in the moment, like on set, like they wanted this extra like layer and kind of like adapting to things as they change. And then she also talked about kind of designing some of the female character costumes. She talked about the shield maidens, and she says who you see like riding during the raid, for example, she's loosely based on a grave finding from 581. And while they were shooting, there was the DNA evidence that emerged that the body in the grave was indeed supposed to be female, certified as female. They thought it was really cool. So they actually did intentionally incorporate that finding into some of their designs and some of their inspiration. And the Valkyrie, of course, was also like this example of a fierce woman. And they wanted to really play into that with the design, with the red cloak and the gold and the swan, and like all these elements were very intentionally conceived to convey certain emotions and feelings and reactions from the audience. But I thought was really, really cool. And that's, it's one of the things I love researching these costumes for all of the movies that we do, because you get such interesting information from the costume designers that I sometimes don't know if general audiences are looking for. I don't know if they know just how much of the visuals they're seeing is informing everything about the movie. I always say a movie with a bad script and good costumes can still be a good movie because the visuals play so much into it. And just seeing like how much effort went into these costumes and went into what they were trying to achieve. And it kills me that it is not doing better at the box office, because it is everything that people are looking for. It is an epic battle. It is gorgeously conceived. It is phenomenal performances. And it's a story that is familiar. I mean, it's Hamlet, it's Lion King. It's something that so you can go into it with an air of familiarity, but then get something completely different out of this. I mean, the reaction I got from this movie was not anything like I've ever got from seeing Hamlet. And I've seen really amazing actors perform Hamlet. I love Lion King, but like there's something about like all of this elements to the Northman that make it a spiritual experience. And I'm not the only person who said it. I saw plenty of people that were referencing that in their reviews. Like there's something powerful about this. Go see it.
I love how passionate you are about this movie.
I love it so much.
Truly, it is still in theaters in some places, so go see it if you haven't. And otherwise, it should be coming to video on demand soon, I think, if it's out of theater by you. But it's definitely worth checking out and trying to see it on like the largest screen possible, I think.
Yes, I agree.
But thank you so much for joining us in our 41st episode of Petticoats and Poppies.
We would love to hear from you on social media and to hear what you think of the Northman.
You can find us on social media at HGATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find Maggie over at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Earglue Media website, and Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating over on Apple Podcasts, on Podchaser, and of course on Spotify, which recently rolled out a review and rating tool on there. Whenever we get reviews, we'd love to get the opportunity to read them and kind of interact with you. So if you want to be featured, be sure to leave us one.
We'll be back soon with another episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Helga no Govar, hun iskana bana 2, Voluspa, Helga Fiel, Epinar, Hildrun, I don't know,